It's the last day of fall.
I know. I don't really think of December as fall either, and I'm definitely in full winter mode myself. But I managed to finish the dress about 2 weeks ago, and I'm not above slipping in this video on a technicality.
The fashion fabric that I'm using to make this seasonal gown is a patterned cotton from Joann fabric that has been in my stash for a good 8 years, so I'm glad it's finally being put to use. As for the pattern, I'm using the same American Duchess guide for the gown skirts as I did for my petticoat. The Bodice's pattern, however, is based on a sized-up and altered version of the pattern pieces that were used in Burnley and Trowbridge's mini mantua making class, which is where I learned how to construct a fully hand-sewn gown, in miniature. While this project will not be fully hand-sewn, the class was invaluable and I highly recommend all costumers to check out their workshops. Cutting the pieces of an English gown involves a little bit of math. The back of the skirt and the back of the bodice are actually one long piece that is pleated to get its shape. To do this, I laid the lining back piece and the center back pattern piece that I used for my petticoat end to end to get the length. I then measured 15 inches across the top of the fabric, as this will give me plenty of fabric to pleat. The bodice back will be pleated to shape by guiding it to match the lining piece, which is cut directly from the lining fabric. Extant gowns of the 18th century with patterned fabric have been both pattern matched and unmatched. I decided I wanted to give pattern matching a try for this gown since I didn't attempt it with my last one. I first traced the center back seam onto the fabric using the pattern piece that I redrafted to my measurements. To make sure the pattern is lining up how I want it, I then pin along the line I drew and flip the fabric over to check. It took a couple tries of this, and then I decided to match up the fabric with the right side up. To shape the center back seam of the fashion fabric, stitch along the marked line. I had actually intended to machine stitch this seam, but I started hand sewing it with a back stitch instead. I think my brain was trying to tell me I need to do something calming for a bit, and the smooth, easy motions of hand sewing are personally very peaceful. I did decide and remember to machine stitch the back lining pieces together though. The seam allowance of the center back seam on the fashion fabric is then cut along the fold and pressed open. One of the main characteristics of an 18th century English gown, or robe à l'anglaise as it's sometimes called, is the pleated back. Working out from the center back seam, I make 2 pleats on either side, the outer or second pleat about half the width of the first. Since this is a mid-18th century gown, I'm making the pleats a bit wider as that was more typical for the time. Once it's pleated, I lay the lining piece over it just to make sure I didn't make the back too narrow. The excess fabric will be cut later. After basting the pleats in place, the lining piece is now carefully attached by matching the center back seams and then using a small running stitch to connect them. I do recommend doing this by hand as well, since it gives more control over making sure the stitch is embedded in the 2 seams. The characteristic back pleats are then decorated and secured by purposely visible spaced backstitching. Since they are meant to be seen, I'm using burnt orange thread so it matches the pattern but stands out on the cream background. Usually you would want a heavyweight thread for this, like a 30-weight silk or 35-2 linen thread, but since this is a polyester thread, I'm using 3 strands to get the desired thickness. I take a brief mock-up intermission at this point since I knew I had my bodice back settled from my last gown, but I needed to check the fit of the rest of the bodice. Since all looks well, I will use these bodice front pieces as my lining. Instead of closing at the center front, this gown will have a stomacher, so I start constructing that by layering some stiff linen in between my fashion fabric and a softer linen lining. I cut the fashion fabric with extra seam allowance to fold in and over the lining, pressing and pinning as I work around it. The curved edge is quite tricky, but with lots of pressing and some patience, it comes out pretty smooth. Once the edges are set, I use a hem stitch to secure them, being careful to only stitch through the 2 layers of linen. To give this stomacher more structure, I attach strips of linen to the back of it and slide in some industrial strength zip ties which I use for boning. Once I know the exact length, I'll trim the ties and hem the strips closed. Now to start on the rest of the bodice. After basting back the front edge of the piece, I lay the lining on top, matching it at the arm side and what will be the side seam. The extra lining fabric at the front edge is then folded and tucked under the basted edge. This will be the pinning strip, which is where the stomacher will be attached by straight pins without causing any damage to your gown's main fabric. You'll need to clip a bit of the fabric to make sure it folds nicely as it moves into the strap. These raw edges will then be folded in and stitched. Then the rest of the pinning strip will be stitched to the bodice's folded front edge. This style of bodice also calls for a dart, so that there is a smooth transition from the bust to the shoulder strap. It is recommended to start with the lining fabric with the point of the dart tapering off towards the center front of the bodice. The fold of the dart is then secured with a hem stitch. Then it's time to make the coordinating dart in the fashion fabric, but on the outside it's more typical to see the fold held down with a spaced backstitch. Once the darts are done, fold in the lining on the front edge of the shoulder strap and hem it in place. It's time to make the rovings, which are strips of fashion fabric that attach to the bodice front and will hide the pinning strip. To do this, I cut strips of fabric and stiffen linen to the length of my bodice piece plus a few extra inches. Then I fold one side and then the other of the fashion fabric to meet over the interior linen. This meeting point is then whip stitched, trying to catch the linen but not let the stitches show through on what will be the right side of the strip. Lay the roving onto the bodice front with the midpoint of the roving to the edge of the pinning strip matching patterns as needed. In earlier decades of the 18th century, rovings were cut as part of the bodice piece and folded into place. In the mid to later part of the century, though, they were made separately like this. Once the rovings are pinned, attach them with a whip stitch to the pinning strip from the interior side of the bodice. Now we have a neatly hidden place to pin the stomacher. The front pieces are fully assembled and ready to be attached to the back of the bodice. First, the lining of both pieces and the fashion fabric of the back piece are pinned together. I machine stitched that bit, but it could also be backstitched by hand. Secondly, the main fabric is folded in and over the new seam and backstitched to give it a hand-finished look. If you want to do less hand sewing, you could reverse this process by sewing the two main fabric pieces and one lining piece together and then whip stitch the remaining lining on the inside for a finished edge. On to the skirts. Fabric in the 18th century was actually weaved much narrower than what is typically sold today. To make a gown like this, many panels of fabric would be pieced together rather than the usual 3, or in this case 5, panels that we see today. I'm using a French seam on the machine for attaching all the panels, which if you'd like to learn more about, I go over how to do this in my petticoat video linked above. I do hem the 2 front edges of this open-styled skirt by hand, as I can do that on the couch with one of my cats for company. With some breaks for scritches, of course. Okay, back to my studio. I put it off until now, but it can't be avoided any longer. The scary cut. That's not the step's actual name, but it is what cutting the waistline has commonly been referred to by customers today. In truth, if you have a well-fitting lining piece, it's not so scary, and worst case scenario, you can piece in some fabric. Before making the cut, I trace the line of my lining pieces onto the fabric, removing any basting stitching that's in the way, and then cut along that line underneath the pleats that form the very back of the gown, just to the start of the hidden innermost fold. This will make room for the skirts. Well, some more room. We've still got to pleat down all of those panels so that the skirt can fit into the bodice. I don't film making the pocket slits for this gown, but that should be done before pleating, and if you'd like more direction on how to do that, I cover it in my petticoat video as well. Once the skirt's width is a fraction of what it was, they can slide into the bodice between the main and lining fabrics. Emphasis on slide here. It's important to push the skirt fabric into the bodice from the side rather than pull it up to meet the curved edge of the bodice. This will mean that there will be extra fabric tucked under the back pleats, as well as an uneven length of the pleats at different points of the bodice. But this will prevent the back pleats from being distorted once the skirt is attached. And speaking of that, to attach all these pleats, the outer side of the bodice is laid over the skirt and then whip stitched together. And the same thing is done on the inside with the lining fabric so that the skirt's raw edge is completely encased. The last major section of construction for this gown is the sleeves, which also happens to be my least favorite part. But first I attach the shoulder strap to the back of the gown on the machine, leaving one lining piece free so that I can fold it over the seam for a clean finish. After what felt like endless sleevel purgatory with my last gown, I am pretty content with the pattern shape I altered for myself, so the process of fitting the sleeves for this gown is not nearly as rough as the last time. To construct them, I lay the sleeve pieces wrong side to wrong side, fold over the lining to match the long edge of the sleeve, and machine stitch the lining pieces to one edge of the fashion fabric. The remaining fashion fabric edge is then folded over the seam and backstitched down. I also leave an inch or so of just the 2 fashion fabric layers sewn together at the cuff edge so that I can turn the raw edges in to finish off the sleeve. This will be done by whip stitching the folded edge of the turned in lining to the folded edge of the fashion fabric. After some triple checking of placement, I set the bottom 3/4 of the sleeve into the arm side by machine. The remaining quarter at the top was pleated to fit in the extra fabric and then tacked down by hand. The roving is then placed over those pleats and stitched down in the back, along with a finishing strip at the neckline. I decided to end the sleeves with cuffs instead of a ruffle, so I hemmed together a thick strip of fashion fabric and lining, and then made 2 large pleats halfway around the cuff and backstitched them down. I then whip stitched the edge of the cuff to the edge of the sleeve. And there you have it, an 18th century gown that completes an autumn ensemble, perfect for a stroll through the falling leaves. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment below about your favorite season for costuming. See you in the new year!